Hi, so it's so nice to see all of you here, and I know it's the last talk of the day, so thank you for sticking around and listening to this. I'm going to be talking about freedom of speech and activism. And what I'd really like to do is sort of start by defining civil society and civil space, and then go into kind of activism and how it's increasingly under threat from government repression, as well as some of these sort of global surges of authoritarianism, nationalism, populism, and extremism, all of which are sort of working collectively and individually to kind of stifle activism in various parts of the world. I'm going to give you a few country examples so that you get a real sense of kind of the tangible, on-the-ground scope of this problem, and then sort of pivot to some ideas of what we can do to sort of push back on these repressive government tactics and maybe consider whether or not there are some collaborative, interesting ways to help empower activists. So what is Civic Space? Civic Space is essentially a set of universal rules of engagement that allows citizens to come together and peacefully interact, sort of mobilize, and try to participate to influence the way the society they live in is shaped. So what is civil society? Civil society exists within civic space. It can be social movements of collective action. It can be online or physical. It can be labor unions and labor organizations that work to enhance worker rights. It can also be sort of informal groupings of advocates and activists who work, again, informally or work together in a more formal grouping in non-governmental organizations or NGOs. It also increasingly has become social entrepreneurs who employ sort of market approaches and innovative techniques to achieve certain social and environmental outcomes. So, the operating space for activism is shrinking, and it's shrinking at a really rapid pace. And this is happening because governments have become increasingly aggressive and sophisticated in the tactics that they use to sort of curb activism. This is happening in authoritarian and semi-authoritarian states, but it's also happening more and more in fragile and emerging democracies, as well as really well-conceived, well-structured economies and democracies across the world. So, there's become a really severe and widespread distrust of activists and activism. This has gotten, to some extent, much worse after the color revolutions in Eurasia and the Arab Spring in the Middle East and North Africa. So you'll remember that these were kind of historic moments, and they involved mass mobilizations of citizens, sometimes sort of prompted and fueled by social media and technology, that really toppled kind of entrenched leaders in the world. Even though they happened in kind of countries where leaders suffered from great corruption and the kind of political, social, economic fabric in those places was a little bit torn, still the unique way in which these unfolded and the pace in which they unfolded, I think has unleashed a bit of a trend of more and more government repression of activists. They see activists as sort of a fundamental threat to their ability to maintain power. And so since these color revolutions and the Arab Spring, governments have really intensified their crackdowns on civil society, not only in the countries and regions in which they happen, but really throughout the globe. So, again, activists and CSOs are being targeted and subject to harassment, to government raids, to imprisonment, and in some cases to death and targeted killings as a result of their work. Governments are also, we're seeing, increasingly controlling the media, conducting smear campaigns, and trying to discredit or imprison, sort of activist bloggers and journalists. We're seeing more surveillance tactics used as well. Surveillance of activists and organizations is growing really, really rapidly, and the use of internet blackouts in some cases and online sort of trolling tactics is also on the rise. So, another thing we're seeing is this prevalence of restrictive legislation regarding NGOs and certain NGOs as non-governmental organizations, and sort of prohibitive reporting requirements and regulations that are being imposed by governments on these organizations. And the idea is really to kind of make it impossible for them to operate if they don't have a wealth of resources to expend on reporting and timekeeping and things like that. This is happening all over the world in really different contexts. So South Sudan Sudan is an example where in the midst of sort of civil conflict, in February of 2016, they managed to pass a very, very restrictive NGO law that places really, really difficult reporting requirements on civil society operating in South Sudan, restricts foreign funding, and erects barriers to kind of digital communications within the CSO community. It's also happening in India, it's happening in the British Virgin Islands. I mean, literally almost any context you can think of, they're starting to pass this type of legislation. We're also seeing sort of crackdowns on universities, which is kind of, it's gained momentum lately. We're seeing more and more arrests of students and professors for just engaging in free speech and freedom of expression. So I'm going to go a little bit into some country examples. I'm going to start with some countries on the African continent. In these countries, we're really talking about sort of explicit harassment and in some cases, violence against activists. So in the DRC, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we're seeing freedom of assembly essentially demolished at this point. Groups, individuals who are speaking out against the current government, groups who are sort of concerned about President Joseph Kabila and the fact that he didn't cede power in 2016 as he was supposed to due to a brokered peace deal, are really under attack. We're seeing sort of political prisoners, detainments, they're languishing in prisons in the DRC, and the ability to sort of gather and engage in any kind of peaceful protest to ensure a fair election is essentially gone there. In Burundi, we're seeing increased violence, really serious violence. In 2013, they passed a law restricting sort of freedom of assembly and freedom of press. Since the government has announced its intention to maintain power illegally, we're seeing severe torture, imprisonment, targeted killings, and again, these are sort of tactics that are being engaged in by the police in conjunction with the militia. And in some cases, they're sort of fueled by some of these laws, but in other cases, they're just arbitrary. I mean, it's just straight violence against activism. So although activism in Burundi and a number of other countries in Africa has become extremely dangerous, it's inspiring to see citizens and citizen groups continue to sort of fight state repression in a serious way. Another thing that we're seeing sort of globally as a trend is the use of security, kind of national security, to stifle activism. So, in the name of maintaining national security and preventing terrorism, for example, we're seeing activists and freedom of speech sort of being stamped out. And it's working pretty well so far. At this point, we have really broad, sweeping terrorist legislation. We have vague legislation and restrictions that often stifle freedom of speech and dissent in general. And they're used, in a lot of cases specifically for that purpose, to really limit activism rather than to kind of weed out terrorists and potential terrorists. So what we need really is more sort of targeted, risk-based, and strategic measures that are specific to kind of terrorism, rather than the kind of broad, vague language that may or may not have to do with sort of terrorist groups per se. So, again, this is happening everywhere. There was a new law that was just passed earlier this year in Hungary. It's extremely broad, it's really vague, and it's, occurring in a country where civil society has become increasingly under assault. We have in Turkey and Uganda recently, prominent journalists were prosecuted on charges of terrorism specifically for exercising freedom of speech and freedom of expression. I just want to give sort of an example of what a broadly written counterterrorism law looks like. This is an example from China, and I'm just going to read it so you get a little bit of a flavor of how vague and broad it is, right? So this 2015 law is written so generally, it encompasses any advocacy or activity that aims to create social panic, undermine public safety, infringe on personal and property rights, or coerce a state organ or an international organization in order to achieve political, ideological, or other objectives, right? So it's extraordinarily broad. If I didn't tell you it was a counterterrorism law, you may not even know that it had to do with terrorism. And again, in China, this law, this counterterrorism law, is used to stifle activism, to sort of imprison activists, to stifle freedom of expression and freedom of speech. So we really need to kind of look at this chasm that's erupted between security and civil society and activism, and how we can bridge that divide. The other thing that's happening globally that's of great concern is this Gongo phenomenon. So Gongos are government-organized, non-governmental organizations. They are expanding at really, really rapid rates. They are relatively new. They're established by the state. They exist now in multiple countries. These state-sponsored organizations espouse state rhetoric. At times they're infiltrating the legitimate NGO community and sort of bringing information back to the state about that community to incriminate them. It's happening quickly, it's happening quietly, and in a lot of countries, citizens can't tell the difference between sort of a Gongo organization and kind of a legitimate NGO. And it's a little bit, it's on the rise, it's happening under the radar in a lot of cases, and it's a troubling phenomenon that's continuing to stifle progressive activist voices in a lot of countries. So, I'm going to pivot a little to consider so what can we do? How can we enhance the resiliency of civil society and activists, particularly in countries where the state is really intent on stamping them out, and in places where these activists really have very little power and very few resources. So, I want to provide a couple of specific potential solutions as well as some general ideas. So one thing I think that we can do that we haven't done is try to define terrorism. The lack of a shared definition of terrorism at the global level allows individual countries to really use deliberately vague, kind of broad constructs of terrorism that don't really address terrorism, but have the effect of stifling activism, stifling dissent, and stifling freedom of speech under sort of the guise of anti-terrorism. So, with legitimate security challenges in mind, it seems like it's time for the international community to sort of define this in a systemic way and really work towards targeting terrorists and potential terrorists rather than just sort of stifling dissent, any kind of non-state or anti-state voice, right? So, I think a new definition coupled with some accountability measures. So when you use a terrorist law, instead of using it to target terrorists, you use it to sort of imprison a journalist who writes something that's anti-state. There should be an accountability measure that's triggered, right? So that governments can't just simply write these laws and then abuse them to stifle activism. So this would potentially lead to an environment where civil society is a little bit freer and a little more independent. They don't constantly have to live in fear that if they say anything anti-state, they may be imprisoned under sort of a security anti-terrorist measure. So, another thing that I think should be done and hasn't really been done is we should try to empower activists and civil society groups to serve as allies in kind of the fight against violent extremism, right? We need to change the narrative a little bit. Right now, they're seen, governments are weakening civil society under sort of the guise of, anti-terrorism. What we need to do is consider that civil society groups who often have access to the most vulnerable and kind of marginalized communities in countries might be a good, a good group of folks to sort of provide a new narrative that's not extremist and kind of push back against some of the potential extremist factions that are targeting the same groups, these sort of vulnerable, marginalized communities. The other thing that's kind of interesting, in the recent sort of decade, I would say, is that there's new social movements, right? There's online activists, there's bloggers, there's social media users, all of which are well, not all of which, but some of which are really interested in human rights and justice. And they can use new modes of engagement, new approaches. They've really sort of started to democratize the advocacy space in a new way that we haven't seen before. But the challenge, I think, is for that group of actors, that sort of loosely organized social media group, to kind of connect with the traditional civil society organizations that are on the ground, and some of whom have been working for many years to kind of fight injustice in their particular context or country. So how can we kind of bring those two groups together to collaborate and coordinate and try to achieve sort of specific aims that would empower activists globally? Again, these two actors should try to focus on their comparative advantages and kind of collectively ensure that activists sustain and potentially even enhance the sort of space for activism. Again, with the new actors, I think social media users who care about specific causes is, that's a great thing, but we need to leverage that momentum so that that group of people has a little bit more of a significant presence in kind of the political and social debates that are ongoing, and that an organization that's been working on rights in Uganda has been involved in already, right? How can we sort of leverage both of these groups in a way that makes sense and towards achieving specific and tangible aims? There's a new opportunity to create these new platforms and new social movements and kind of connect the grassroots folks to the new actors. But in order to do that, I think we need a lot more. We need to sort of facilitate new learning about what's working, what's worked in specific contexts to kind of push back against government repression and what hasn't. We may need to create sort of collaborative learning spaces, both virtual or physical or both, where we consider what tactics we should use to push back on government repression in certain countries or regions or even globally, and how to connect these now disparate sort of groups of actors. So just to kind of conclude, I would say that the trend is really troubling. I mean, I've been working in this space for a while, and the space for activism I see is really shrinking, and it's shrinking really rapidly through both these kind of covert tactics I mentioned, but also through these very overt, explicit harassment and, in some cases, violent tactics. And this is happening in part because of the historical catalyst, but also just because of these surges in extremism and nationalism and authoritarianism. But on a bright note, I think there's opportunities for technology sort of coupled with political and strategic thinking to sort of bring activists together and help them connect with one another and collectively, systemically kind of push back on some of this state repression. But again, I think this is going to require new platforms and new sorts of thinking where tech experts, policy experts, grassroots organizations all kind of are able to come together in some sort of collaborative way and aim to achieve really specific, tangible ends rather than just sort of consider the fact that, human rights and injustice are being perpetrated in country X or by, so-and-so person. They need to sort of come together and really come up with a strategy on how they can work together to push back on this trend, because this trend now has become profound, it's become global, and as to circle back to where I started, governments have become very savvy in terms of using tactics, online tactics, sort of police tactics, legislation, all of these things to sort of really stifle activism and freedom of speech. And so they're really winning this war at this point, and we're really behind. The activist community, I think, is just struggling to survive at this point. So we need new thinking, we need new actors, and we need sort of more coordination. So that's it for me. I don't know if there are questions.
Wow. Holy crap, wow. All right. I don't have any questions just up yet on Slido.com, but if any of these lovely people would love to offer up a question on Slido.com. Oh, wait, there is one. There you go. Hello. And you can read it here. What do you think of this incident that the police backlisted journalists at the G20 summit who worked in Turkish Kurdish regions? Do you know anything about this? Do you have an idea?
I know a little bit. I mean, I think, again, it's part of a much larger phenomenon that's happening. And, I hope that I've tried to sort of draw attention to the fact that this is happening now in so many different contexts and in so many different countries. It's not, we've always had historically despotic authoritarian governments that kind of clamp down on activists, that stifle freedom of speech, that smear journalists. But now it's happening everywhere and in different ways. And I think this is another example of that. I mean, I think, with the G20 summit and the sort of Turkish Kurdish, that's really I think that was a geopolitical move. They just didn't want to have sort of, Kurdish dissenters kind of involved, and I think that had a lot to do with some of the geopolitics. But I think the fact that they did it, again, is evidence that this is happening, and it's become sort of accepted. I mean, we're living in a world where it happens so much that we almost have come to accept it as truth. I mean, it happens in America, it happens in South Sudan. I was just saying, in South Sudan, which is a radically different context, right? In the middle of civil strife, warring factions are coming together to sort of hate on civil society. So, it's a sort of newish phenomenon, at least the pace and the scope at which it's occurring.
As there's no other questions just yet, I'm going to ask one of my own.
Oh, okay.
I hope that's okay.
Sure.
Overall, do you feel positive or negative about the future?
So, it's a tough question. I think that from what I've seen, kind of working on this recently, it's disheartening to see how quickly activism is fading, and how successful these kind of authoritarian tactics have been in weeding out real freedom of speech. I mean, I think like where I started this sort of civic space has really, really declined, particularly I think since the Arab Spring and the color revolutions. And it's happening in like I said, it's happening in both covert and overt ways. DRC and Burundi are examples of countries that have always had, issues, right? But the tactics there have gotten more violent and more severe. And then you're dealing with countries like Hungary, where civil society is also under assault in kind of a different way. And it's being silenced through legitimate-ish legislation, but that legislation is being used really to sort of push them to the side. And so, I would say it's a disheartening trend, but where I ended is, I think that there are new actors, and potentially there's a real need for new actors and new thinking in this space. And so I'm hoping that happens soon, that people get involved in this in a strategic and thoughtful way.
Cool. That's really yes. Interesting. All right. No, I mean, sorry. I follow Hans-Lotte Yang, who does a lot of data, pure data, and not the political conversation or anything of this, and the statistical trends of longer life, fewer birth rates and stuff like this, better women's education. They all point up, but it's a conversation that we need to have about where it goes after. Like, you can only see the past and know that. Cool. Anyway, on to the next question. Talking about technology, how do you think, or what are your ways that you can see that activists can be united? Is there a way through technology?
So I'm not really a technology person, which is why I think we need to bring some tech folks into this discourse in a serious way. But I mentioned, I think, the idea of having these collaborative learning spaces, and either virtual or physical, and then potentially having new platforms, like new and innovative narratives and platforms to bring together activists from different parts of the world, as well as activists who are kind of more virtual, and activists who are literally on the ground in Uganda, kind of fighting for their rights. I think that actually that interchange between those two groups of actors would be really interesting, but I think technology can certainly help facilitate that, and should. So hopefully that'll happen soon. I'm looking forward to that. Okay,
just two more questions. I hope everyone is okay with that. China just announced they'll be looking to block the use of VPN very soon. Any way for activists to counter, or any way for us to go there? And do you see any news? Anything?
China is obviously a very unique context, and I think that, in all of these countries, I think there's certain strategic things that one can do to try to stem this tide of repression. And I think, in China, activists are struggling, I think, with how to do that. And I do think that there are ways to do that. I mean, I mentioned some of the counterterrorism laws and the security issues, but, inherent in that is the idea that the multilateral community, the international community, will take a little bit more of a role in sort of empowering activists in China, and not necessarily through the discourse that we've had, which is like, oh, you, China, should pay more attention to the things that we, the US and the West, care about, right? You should care about human rights. I think that's actually, that historically has been a bit of a losing battle. So I think, doing it kind of in more interesting ways, like this idea of a new definition of terrorism that's a little more, targeted and strategic, I think that's a way to engage China and help the activist community there without seeming patronizing or too sort of Western-centric. So, I mean, that's what I would say about the China context.
Okay. Lucky last question from Yash or Josh. How do you break through the filter bubbles? I mean, there's a huge amount of conversation here around nationalism or having extreme left and right orientation, or digital media, maybe Trump, fake news, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think?
Well, you know, I think that, so I'm not sure I understand the last part of the question, so I'll take the first part, which is kind of the conversations around nationalism and sort of, I guess, the divide between the left and the right. I mean, I think that we're seeing this in the US, for example, because you mentioned it, in a unique context, right? It's happening in a unique way. There's like a nationalist, populist, tide there. We're seeing a little bit more, of course, fake news. You know, the role of the digital media is kind of strange with respect to both fake news and kind of elevating, you know, social media as part of a political discourse. But you know, that type of thing is happening in different contexts all over the world, right? So you see a different type of nationalism, populism, use of social media and digital media in other contexts, but with you know, in a lot of cases with similar results. I mean, it's really to stamp out the progressive voices and allow more kind of sweeping security measures or authoritarian-like measures to kind of rise to the surface. So, you know, I think that we need to talk about what is real and get away a little bit, I think, from some of the, you know, the smoke, I guess, and talk about the fact that this is happening globally now. You know, it's different in every context, but what's happening is you have these surges of nationalism and authoritarianism, and they're essentially working in different ways to stamp out progressive voices. So those progressive activist voices need to try to come together and fight against that tide in a collective way.
Amazing. Cool. So much depth of knowledge. It's really, really impressive. Thank you
Nice.
so much, and give her a big round of applause.
Thank you, guys.
All right. Thank you. It was really, really nice.